Welcome to Gilder Lehrman's Book Breaks today, where we'll be taking a look at Amanda Bellows' The Explorer, A New History of America in 10 Expeditions. We want to take a minute, or I'd like to take a minute, to thank our sponsor, Citizen Travelers. Citizen Travelers makes it possible for book breaks to be free for everyone. So thank you so much to them for giving us this wonderful opportunity with Amanda today. And viewers like you make book breaks possible. So if you would like to contribute to the program, please follow the link, email bookbreaks@gilderlehrman.org. And in advance, thank you so much for your generous support. And thank you to all of our donors for making all of the Gilder Lehrman programming that we know and love possible. My name is Cheryl Ann Amendola. I am your Book Breaks guest host today. I'm the 2017 New Jersey History Teacher of the Year, and I'm a master teacher with Gilder Lehrman, and I'm so excited to be here. And Jared is going to be with us later. He is our Book Breaks intern. And without further ado, the person you're actually here to see and listen to, Amanda Bellows. She has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Talking Points Memo. She is also the author of American Slavery and Russian Serfdom in the Post-Emancipation Imagination. She currently teaches at the New School in New York City, and we're here to discuss her book, The Explorers, A New History of America in 10 Expeditions. I have read this cover to cover. I've reread a couple of chapters. It is an amazingly interesting, wonderful, compelling book. Amanda, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to see you, and it's great to be with everyone here. Thanks for tuning in.
So before we get started, I know that most of our viewers can see the slide and read, but in case you don't know what The Explorers is about, Amanda Bellows writes over 2 centuries and many thousands of miles about explorers. She explores no pun intended, I guess, a different definition for exploration, and also tells us and teaches us about people that we may not have heard of, or if we've heard of them, delves a lot deeper into their lives than maybe we've been before. So thank you so much for all of the work that you did on this book. If you don't mind, can I start with a couple of questions?
Absolutely.
Okay, so your book had me hooked from the prologue, from the very first sentence. And in your prologue, you challenge readers to expand their definition of exploration beyond land acquisition, which is a lot of what we really think about, the frontier, the West, maybe even the final frontier. And you ask us to consider the consequences of settlement and development, as well as give our attention to a broader group of explorers. How did you come to this conclusion yourself in order to write the book?
Yes. Well, I was thinking about exploration really broadly, and I was thinking about figures who typically come to mind when I thought of exploration. So figures like Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett, Jim Bowie, Kit Carson. So men of a particular demographic operating on the Western frontier. But I thought there's got to be much more than this idea of exploration and these kind of handful of explorers. So I set out to write a book that captured and told the stories of men and women of diverse backgrounds whose discoveries contributed to the development of the United States. So the book takes a really broad look at the history of exploration through the lives of these 10 compelling figures. It begins in 1776 with the founding of the Republic, and it goes all the way through the Cold War era and the space race. Ending the last chapter talks about Sally Ride. And then the epilogue talks about the future of exploration. So where do we think the newest frontiers are?
The epilogue actually had me asking a lot of questions. So, I mean, some of the things that you might think about people who are in our audience when you read the book is, what don't I know? What do I assume about this world and this planet that I live in that maybe I should drop that assumption? Or what is it that I take for granted? What am I not asking? These are the things that you address in the book with each explorer, and it's so interesting to see the development. Would you mind elaborating on the criteria you use to select the specific 10 explorers like Ride and Earhart, Shepard, Henson, Adams? Why did you choose them to represent the new history of America, and how did you approach your research?
Great. Yes. So there are 10 chapters in the book, and I chose one figure to represent each period in history. So it's more than just a collection of 10 randomly chosen biographies. It shows how it shows the diversity of individuals who have been explorers. So female explorers, African American explorers, explorers who were indigenous, explorers who were immigrants. And then each person's life is set within a particular period of US history. So the first chapter starts with the core of discovery, told from Sacagawea's perspective. And then we move through the gold rush, the homestead era. We talk, as the periods of history change, about how the objectives of explorers changed, which is something you mentioned at the beginning. So while the earliest explorers, broadly speaking, are thinking about the acquisition of land or the resources inland, later on, when we have someone like John Muir, we're starting to think about the birth of the conservation movement and exploring for the purposes of preservation or conservation. Or a figure like Florence Merriam Bailey, who was an ornithologist and who explored to save birds during this Gilded Age crisis when, birds were being slaughtered in the name of fashion and for hunting. So the first half of the book, part one, covers the five periods and explorers that I just mentioned. So Sacagawea, the Mountain Man, James Beckworth, Laura Ingalls Wilder, John Muir, and Florence Bailey. And all of those explorers are set doing their exploring within the boundaries of the continental United States. So the part one ends with the closing of the frontier in 1890. Part two looks at five explorers after 1890 who went beyond the bounds of the continental United States and looked for adventure abroad. So we have William Shepherd, who was the first African-American missionary to the Congo, and he was an activist who exposed King Leopold II's atrocities there. Harriet Chalmers Adams goes to South America in the early 1900s and travels to every country and contributes as one of the first female photographers and writers to National Geographic. Then we move to the Arctic. I think my favorite chapter is the chapter about Matthew Henson and polar exploration. So this is a period in the early 1900s when there's a race to the North Pole, a global race with different countries. And Matthew Henson and Robert Peary are the first to make it as close as you could get to the North Pole using the instruments of the day, people say. Then we move, beyond land in terms of frontiers, and we move to air. So I look at Amelia Earhart in the book, thinking about air as a new frontier. And then the last chapter talks about the space race, space as a new frontier, rocket power getting people into space, the moon landing, and then Sally Ride on the Challenger. So we see how types of frontiers change over time, the goals of explorers change over time, and then each of the 10 figures represents that particular period in history.
I thought it was really great the way you moved through the book, because I was thinking about ways that I could use this with my students, and what you do connecting each explorer to the time period that they're in. And like, you do this fantastic job layering the history of what's happening in the US and in the world with what the explorers are actually trying to accomplish, and how the history connects with their choices and their challenges, and why we may or may not have heard of them. That was an interesting thing in the book too, because one of the questions that I was thinking is, why haven't I heard of not any of these people, or many of these people, or
Right.
why haven't I dug so deeply into these stories? And you do such a great job of explaining the why behind it. How would you advise those of us who teach history to help students understand that nothing happens in a vacuum? So what's happening in the world is interrelated with everything that's going on.
Yes. I think that these different explorers' stories, I think that I tried to situate the stories in the greater context of world history, as well as to show the links between the different stories. So I think something else that's important that you're talking about in terms of teaching is to show how things that happen in one generation can have a significant impact on people of another generation. And that is something that we definitely see throughout the history of exploration as well.
So like, I'm thinking of some specific examples, like when you wrote about Amelia Earhart, then wrote about Sally Ride and thought about what the connection between Earhart and Ride was, and what would Earhart have thought of exploring space as opposed to and going around the world 16
Yeah.
times as opposed to once in an airplane.
Yes. So one kind of theme of the book is technology and how technology powers exploration and makes it possible for people to reach new frontiers. And that's definitely true in the case of air and space. But if you just go back to the very beginning and you think about the members of the Corps of Discovery and Sacagawea in their, in their boats going up the Missouri River, right? It's such an arduous journey to go from St. Louis, Missouri, all the way to Oregon and back. It takes 2 years. Then by the middle of the 19th century, you have the invention of the railroad. That the Transcontinental Railroad is completed in 1869, and that gets people from the East Coast to the West Coast a lot faster than before. Steamships are another way that move people around the world much quicker than they used to go. For instance, William Shepard travels from America to Europe and then to Africa. And then another area where we see, this huge shift powered by technology is from the polar explorers and, a decade and a half later to these aviators. So when Matthew Henson is racing to the North Pole, they take a ship, they spend the winter in Greenland, and then they take their dog sleds and they make that launch towards the pole, which takes weeks. And that whole journey takes a year to go from New York to the North Pole and then come all the way home. When you have aviators in the, in the 19 teens trying to get to the North Pole in airships and in airplanes, it takes them, a matter of hours instead of a matter of months. So airplanes are one area where we see that rapidly increasing, your ability to get from point A to point B, particularly in polar regions. And then, of course, when you have rocket power, that just blows everything else out of the water in terms of speed. So Amelia Earhart dies trying to circumnavigate the globe, and that's a journey that takes weeks and weeks. But as you mentioned, right, by the time Sally Ride is in her space shuttle, she's going around the world, 16 times in the course of one day. And that's just something, 50, 60 years earlier that Amelia Earhart probably couldn't even have dreamed of.
It was also interesting to read about how Matthew Henson, as an Arctic explorer, definitely did not get the recognition that he deserved, particularly from white newspapers, because of Jim Crow America.
Yes. So some of the stories, as you mentioned, have kind of been lost to history. So the mix of names in the book, you'll be familiar with some, like Amelia Earhart, who was married to a publicist, right? Her own publicist, George Putnam. And, they worked together and captured the attention of newspapers, and she had her own fashion line. And she just, she may not have been the most technically skilled aviator of her day, but she was certainly the most well-known. But then you have a figure like Matthew Henson, right, who is the, he's on this expedition led by Commander Robert Peary, who was a white man. And, Peary basically, deliberately tried to claim all of the glory for that expedition. And the two of them are going to the North Pole during the era of Jim Crow. So Matthew Henson's accomplishments, both before and after the expedition, were really downplayed in the white newspapers, run and newspapers of the time. People would write about him using the wrong name. And it was really just all about Peary. Now, after they returned from the North Pole, again, Robert Peary just gets all of the glory, and Henson is kind of a side note, at least in those white-owned newspapers. But what's really amazing is how the Black-owned newspapers with predominantly Black readerships, they are just right on acknowledging and praising Henson for all of the fantastic contributions that he had to the success of the expedition, which certainly would not have succeeded without him. Henson was fluent in the Inuit language. He knew how to build dog sleds. He wore, he basically adapted to the environment, having learned from the Inuit people about how to survive in these tough conditions. And in an interview, Henson even said, Robert Peary had frostbite, and so it was difficult for him to be super mobile. And so Henson said in an interview at one point in the aftermath that basically Henson was in the lead sled, and then he stops, and then he waits for Peary to come. And then they figure out that, using their instruments, that they're at the North Pole. So technically, Henson was probably the first person ahead of Peary to reach the North Pole. But that story just is, lost to history, and Peary got all of the glory when they got back. And it wasn't until decades later, really, that Henson's story began to be told more accurately.
So the book, I mean, we already started talking about it a little bit, highlights a lot of really complex issues with exploration. So there's social consequences to exploration, and there were environmental consequences to exploration. You mentioned in depth and a lot throughout the book the consequences for Indigenous peoples.
Yes.
Would you mind elaborating a little bit on that?
Yes. So it's really important to me as a historian to make sure that readers have the full picture of history. And exploration is one of those topics that is really complicated. Some people are benefiting from exploration, and some people are harmed by the consequences of exploration, particularly when you're looking at the Western frontier. Someone like Lewis and Clark and Sacagawea on the core of discovery, right? They're predominantly gathering information, geographic information. They gain information about plants and animals. They're making diplomatic relations with the different tribes that they meet. And they they make the journey. They find out there's no Northwest Passage. They come back and they make, Clark has this wonderful map, and everyone has a much clearer sense of what it's like in the far West and how you can navigate that terrain. But with that information comes increased settlement and desire of other Americans to go and move to the West and get access to land and gain resources. And so, of course, increased settlement leads to the displacement of Indigenous people who are living in the West, the spread of disease to which there is little to no immunity, and that leads to many, many deaths among Indigenous people, the violence of settlers against Indigenous people. So I think in the history of exploration, and I tried to do this in all the different areas, was just to show, right, what the real and true consequences were at different moments in history, and particularly they're negative for Indigenous people, which is a real tragedy.
And in a lot of the cases for the explorers that you write about, particularly in part one, they're not even thinking about the consequences for Indigenous people. They're just like, let's move here and let's live there. I'm thinking about Laura Ingalls Wilder and her family.
Yes. Yes, that's an important example. So I started out Laura Ingalls Wilder's chapter with the story of the treaty that the Yankton Sioux signed. So there were a couple representatives of the Yankton Sioux of South Dakota, and they were in Washington, and they signed this treaty giving away, most of their land. And then, the people that were in Washington didn't represent all the people who were living in South Dakota among the Yankton Sioux. And so when they found out that this treaty had been signed, they were outraged, but it was, it had been signed. And so they were all forcibly moved onto this one little area of land. And then you have decades later, you've got Laura Ingalls Wilder's manuscript when she's remembering what it was like to move to Dakota Territory. And, it looks so empty to her. She's on, the grasslands. There's nobody you can see for miles. There are no structures. And to her, it seems like it's totally, a new and undiscovered place. But if you look at it historically, right, of course, you have to know the full history to understand what was really happening. And in that case, right, the Yankton Sioux had been forcibly removed from their homelands. And that made it possible for settlers like Laura and other homesteaders then to farm on that land.
So how do you think teachers can guide their students to critically analyze the motivations and consequences of the expeditions you cover in your book?
Well, I think one thing that's useful is that the book really looks closely at 10 individuals. So by looking at their own words within the context of the environments in which they're operating, you can really get a clear sense of what these individual people's objectives were. I think it could be trickier to, speak broadly about all explorers in a particular time period. So I would say my one piece of advice to teachers would be to use specific examples and to get a sense of what, why people were doing what they were doing in a particular moment in history.
Um, I want to shift gears a little bit because I have a wonder because a, a lot of exploration is, I feel like, focused on nation building. And I feel like a lot of our courses that we teach when we teach American history are based on nation building. And it really doesn't matter what time period you're teaching, because it can be nation building as in Thomas Jefferson's era and Lewis and Clark, and Sacagawea, or you can move all the way to Sally Ride, the space race, and the Cold War. It's different types of nation building, but
Sure.
it is still nation building to me. So how does the concept of exploration intersect with questions of America and identity and nation building?
I think that's a great question. And I think you're spot on to say that that's an element of many people's, maybe not all of the explorers in the book, but many of their goals or the environments in which they're operating, right? Other people are pursuing that goal of nation building, whether it's something like, the core of discovery, right? They're gathering information. Thomas Jefferson sent them off to figure out, what's out there. But so much of it is about nation building. For instance, the establishment of relations with different indigenous peoples, and that being, they want them wanting to trade with people and to have trade routes and to figure out what resources are out there. So, I mean, I think from the very beginning of the book, that is, a really clear thing. But then that thread, kind of, it's changing over time, but parts of it remain the same. So I'm just thinking about other chapters. For instance, the race to the North Pole, right? That's a privately funded expedition. Robert Peary raises money through the Peary Arctic Club, which later joins and becomes the Explorers Club of New York City. So it's a lot of Gilded Age industrialists raising money for that. But at the same time, right, it's the early 1900s. This race, their successful trip was 1908 to 1909. And it's a period that's really like the age of imperialism, and nations all around the world are kind of vying to show who's the strongest and most powerful and to be the first to do X, Y, and Z. And so, you know, Henson writes about like planting that flag at the North Pole and that kind of pride for himself and pride of country is kind of at the forefront of what he's talking about when he plants that flag. I think you could argue that the space race definitely too has to do with nation building when you have this geopolitical crisis between the United States and the Soviet Union. So this time it's not privately funded. The government, right, is pouring millions of dollars into building new spacecraft and trying to get people onto the moon and trying to master space because there are fears between the US and the Soviet Union about what could happen if the other person mastered space and then so I think that's in a sense about nation building as well. So plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose from the beginning of the book to the end. Different kinds of nation building.
I was also thinking about the planting of the flag in the North Pole, and how, I mean, Henson put it down in the name of the United States, a country that didn't really honor him and his identity and who he was.
Yeah.
And then like thinking about Amelia Earhart, where she was told she couldn't fly, and Sally Ride, NASA would never have a female astronaut, or even Florence Marion Bailey, and like the obstacles she had to like overcome in order to be able to study and become who she was. So almost all of the explorers that you profile were historically marginalized in one way or another and told by society that they can't because of their gender or their race or their sexuality, because society considered them to be physically or mentally limited.
Yes.
So how did you feel wrestling with the complexity of each one of their journeys?
I mean, I felt inspired by the way that they overcame those obstacles. And I think what's striking is that many of them, as you said, grew up in environments where their opportunities were limited by society. So, to give a few examples, James Beckworth, he was an African American mountain man. He was born into slavery in Virginia. His mother was likely enslaved. His father was a white landowner. We don't, the full picture has been lost to history, but his father moved him to St. Louis and he got a little bit of an education there. And then his father emancipated him. And so, Beckworth says, I've just had this desire to go out west and see the Rocky Mountains. He's living in St. Louis at a time when people are starting to trap and trade. And you've got these fur trading expeditions. And so he sees the frontier as a place where it's less constricting and it doesn't have the same kind of black-white binary that antebellum Virginia had with slavery. And so he's able to move in such an interesting way through different communities in the West. He kind of embeds himself among the Crow people. He claims to have become a Crow chief. He has several indigenous wives. Then he doesn't live with, then he leaves the Crow and he's in Gold Rush, California. At another time, he's living in the Southwest, and married to someone there. So he's a really enigmatic and creative and entrepreneurial figure who I think, finds more possibility on the frontier than he would have had he been, continued to be enslaved in antebellum Virginia. So his story, I think, really speaks to that dynamic that you're talking about. But then for, the female explorers as well, Amelia Earhart, she never, she grew up, she was born in the late 19th century, and she just was always pushing kind of those gender boundaries, what was acceptable for a woman of her time. So she's slowly cutting her hair shorter and hoping her parents won't notice. And she becomes really interested in aviation, which of course so few women are interested in or able to do at that time. And she starts dressing kind of like the male pilots do and wearing their clothes. So she's pushing those boundaries and also, right, finding a degree of freedom as a pilot and just saying, I don't care about what other people expect of me. I want to go and do this thing that I love so much and that I have so much passion for. And so stories like that, where people just, move beyond either the expectations or they push past the really like the legal constrictions of their time to find opportunities in these different kinds of frontiers. I find that really, really moving.
So how do you see the legacies of your 10 explorers continuing to influence American society today?
Great question. I think that I'm thinking about what we were talking about with high school students and college students. I teach a class about exploration in U.S. history, but I think there's a story for everyone here in this book. I think, no matter what your interests are in different periods of American history, I think that you will find yourself moved by the stories of these different individuals who overcame obstacles, who made really significant discoveries at great risk, et cetera. One thing we haven't talked about that I think might be interesting to consider is what makes someone an explorer. Like, what traits or personality traits enable a person to succeed as an explorer, or maybe even make someone drawn to that as a kind of a career. And so I think when I was researching the book, some of the traits that came to mind might be more obvious, like curiosity or a drive to discover a particular thing that they were interested in finding, whether it be, finding out what was actually at the North Pole, or someone like Harriet Chalmers Adams, right, who was deeply interested in the geography of South America and the people of South America. And she wanted to go to every country that the Spanish had ever colonized, probably largely influenced by her upbringing in California. But the thing that surprised me most in terms of these traits, I kind of wondered, like, what was why were they able to tolerate risk? What would prompt them to leave home and maybe leave family members behind and go off and put their lives at really great, significant risk? And one pattern that I noticed among the different explorers was that many of the men and women had a really troubled upbringing. So they either had, parents who they were either orphaned or they weren't raised by their parents, or they had, marriages that were broken. Child rearing did not appear to be compatible with exploring. Of the 6 women, only 2 of the women had children. And so it made me wonder kind of the connection between a tolerance for risk and then some of these relationship dynamics that they experience either as children or as young adults.
That's a really great question, and something that I'm thinking could go with my students is this idea of wonder. So the people in this book had the courage to wonder and the capacity to wonder. And what do you wonder? Where will you go? So that might be a really nice tie-in. Amanda, thank you so much for letting me talk to you about this wonderfully fabulous book. I think Jared put in the chat where that you can buy it from the Gilder Lehrman bookstore. And I'm going to hand it over to Jared now to do some audience Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Cheryl-Ann, and hosting. And of course, thank you so much, Amanda, for joining us here on Book Breaks. It's been a pleasure to be able to listen to you both back and forth this afternoon and now be able to host the audience portion of the program. And just a quick hello to our audience. My name's Jared. I'm an intern here at Gilder Lehrman. I do a lot of behind the scenes here at Book Breaks. And if you have a question here today, you can use the Q&A portion on Zoom and maybe asked in this portion of the program. But before we get to the audience questions, we do first have a question from our History Scholar of the Week. The History Scholar of the Week is a weekly competition in which students may ask our guests a question for a chance for themselves and their teacher to win a $50 gift card to the Gilder Lehrman gift shop. And so our History Scholar for the week this week is John from St. Michael Catholic School in Minnesota. And he asks, was there one or multiple explorers who were left out of your book that you felt could have been included and maybe worth mentioning and maybe briefly explaining some significance to us?
That's a great question. I love that question. And congratulations on being the History Scholar of the Week. So there were 2 people that were originally on the list of 10 who got cut for different reasons. The first person was Elizabeth Cochrane, also known as Nellie Bly, who raced around the world to see if she could complete it in a certain number of days, kind of inspired by Jules Verne's story. And she was a progressive era journalist. And she was originally in the spot where William Shepard was going to be. But when I learned about William Shepard's very compelling story about going to the Congo and becoming this amazing activist and the missionary work that he did, I just thought his story was so unusual and compelling in the way that he, garnered, well, no, sorry, the way that he explored in the service of helping the Congolese people and then exposing King Leopold II's atrocities against them was such an unusual and powerful story that I thought that maybe more people knew Nellie Bly's story. So I switched them. And then I really just love the story of the race to the moon. And so originally the last chapter was going to end with Neil Armstrong, but so many of you know so much about Neil Armstrong already, and not as many people know so much about Sally Ride. So the story of the moon landing is in the book, but the chapter about the space base really focuses on Sally Ride's exciting story instead.
Well, it's a pleasure to hear about Sally Ride, especially as someone who's lesser known and in terms of what she brings to the table, especially as she was refused, as you were saying earlier, by NASA and really was a pioneer in her field.
Yes.
Moving into the audience, Chris asks, what is one piece of information that you really wanted to find in your research but could not? Or what is something that you really wanted to find out in general?
Good question. Well, I don't know if there was one single thing that I was looking for that I wanted to find. Well, actually, there was. And I'll tell you one thing that I was frustrated that I didn't have an answer to, and I'll tell you what that is. But generally speaking, I will say that I was writing this book during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so a lot of archives were closed. So there were definitely places that I wanted to go to that were not open during the research portion of this book. So, I was able to get digitized scans of things and, many things are available, but I do wonder, right, had more places been open to me, what could I have found? You'll note there are a couple things. There are a couple things that are still sort of mysteries even after publication. One of the really interesting discoveries that I made while writing the book was about Harriet Chalmers Adams. There's a great photographic album that is housed in an archive, and I have a digitized copy of it, but it's not, so the pictures align with her journey to South America, and it's remarkable to have pictures of all of these places that she writes about in her unpublished journals. But we don't know, we know that the pictures weren't most likely hers, but we don't know exactly whose they were, and the dates are a little bit funny. So there's kind of a mystery, and you can, if you care deeply about that, you can look at the footnotes to see more about that. But that was one of the things that I wish, we had more information on.
History always has its mysteries, it seems. Linda asks now, a really good question. Did any of the 10 individuals you featured express regrets for exploring and opening an entry point into another place and/or a group of Indigenous people?
Interesting. I'm going to think about that for a second. I think Laura Ingalls Wilder's story is worth bringing up here because many of you are probably familiar with the Little House stories, and maybe some of you have also read her manuscript, which was published, within the last 5 or 10 years, that kind of gives the real, gritty behind the scenes story of what really happened. Not the sort of sanitized children's version in the Little House books, but it was really, they had really rough time in Dakota Territory, and neither her family, her family of her childhood, nor when she was living with her husband, were they able to make a success of farming. So they have to eventually, her house burns down and they're just deeply impoverished, she and her husband and their young daughter. And they, just leave Dakota to, what's then South Dakota, right, with nothing. And they have to make a new home for themselves in Mansfield, Missouri. And, there are times when she comes back, she takes a trip back to South Dakota later in her life. And you can read in her letter about that journey, right? This like really conflicting feeling about what had happened there and settlement. And she makes some comments about Indigenous people as well. And so, I mean, at least I wondered reading that and reading about the broader story of what happened in South Dakota, like all these people came there and the Native Americans had been displaced, and, people couldn't make a success of farming because the land and the climate weren't even suited to farming. And so it just seems like that is just such a tragic chapter in terms of the consequences for Indigenous people there.
Thank you for highlighting that in your examination of your explorers. And kind of on that topic, we have a question from Chris, and he asks, are there any examples of Native Americans exploring simply for the sake of exploring and just beyond just migrating to settle in a new area?
That's a good question. Well, I'll say that, in the prologue of the book, I just want to point out, right, that the earliest American explorers are the people that came across the Bering Strait thousands of years ago. And, I was reading about how there's new evidence suggesting that people may even have come across the Atlantic in skin boats. So I think it's important not to overlook all the people that we don't know their names, and we don't know each of their individual stories, but I think they were all explorers doing something incredibly, incredibly brave at that time. And then just to take that one more step, because I know that it sounds like the question is also about in the time period of the book. I wish that I had found more sources about particular Indigenous people and whether they would have considered themselves explorers, say like in the early 19th century. But I would recommend checking out the journals of Lewis and Clark as a primary source, because they're very detailed and they give a remarkable accounts of all the different Indigenous people living in all the different parts of the country that they pass through, and it's extensive, and so it really gives you a sense. And so they'll explain in the journals, like, this is what this group of people knew about this, so the Shoshones, right, living in Idaho, like, did they know about the Pacific Ocean? And there would be some people who had maybe traveled like far enough to have talked to somebody who said, like, there's a big ocean or a big lake there. And so, like, there was knowledge being passed among different Indigenous peoples depending on where they were moving and traveling. So that's one way of getting information about different Indigenous explorers in the early 19th century.
Well, thank you for that recommendation, Amanda. It sounds like a great primary source. Miriam now asks, did you see the reputations and missions of the explorers shift over time? And she's thinking particularly of historians and history of the time periods in terms of today as well.
Yes. I think that in recent years, some of the people on this list have been kind of like reevaluated, like a figure like John Muir, right, who is a conservationist and helped establish Yosemite, and that paved the way for other national parks, right? In the last 5 years, let's say, people have taken a much closer look at what his relationships were like with indigenous people, and African Americans. And so I think, again, for each of the explorers, I tried to give a full picture of what they were like in terms of their perspectives and, their failings as individuals, and also their accomplishments. Trying to think of other examples in terms of, let's see, people today. And then, someone like James Beckworth, he was pretty famous in his own day. He had published his autobiography about being a mountain man and all these adventures he had on the Western frontier and the different communities he lived in. So in his own day, he was famous, and there were, obituaries written about him in newspapers. And, his autobiography does have like very sensationalized material in it, which made it like a little more challenging to treat as a primary source. So you kind of have to like cross-check with other things. But then there's this period where like he's largely forgotten from history. And I would say in the last 20 to 30 years, right, people have been giving his story more attention, and it's come back to light, and people are doing great research. But that's an example of a figure who was really well known in his day, and then who sort of got forgotten with time, and then we're kind of remembering their story more clearly now.
Gotcha. We have 2 questions from teachers now. We have a lot of K through 12 educators joining us here on Book Breaks. And Ken asks, as a middle school teacher who is supposed to introduce the classic explorers in history, do you think it is more worthwhile these days to focus on your town, since they represent similar themes, especially in terms of using the technology of their time and adventuring, or is there just one or two that should be highlighted in your opinion? Of course, you are the writer of the book, so your 10 explorers are, obviously, you mentioned 2 other ones that were cut, but they all have tremendous value. So, what is your take?
Yeah, no, I mean, it depends on probably what the parameters of, how much time you have to teach and what period you are looking at. But I think one benefit of this structure of this book that really might lend itself to high school or college classes is the fact that it is a survey of US history, and each person represents a different time period. And there's really like a diversity of backgrounds and experiences and aspirations of these different figures too. So I think you could highlight some based on what period you're looking at, or if you had the time to do a whole survey, and you could probably find more people to add as well that could fit in as, and or even go beyond, they're definitely like, exploration does not end with Sally Ride in 1983, right? We've done a lot more exploring since then. So you could also bring the book either closer to the present or go pre-1776 as well.
Absolutely. And I loved how you spanned that, even though there is some room present day and even beforehand, you did a great job spanning and showing us that survey of US history, as you just mentioned.
Thanks.
Carol thanks you for your presentation today and asks, although it might be a tough question, if you could highlight the top 5 people that contributed, because as teachers, she said she wants to share these accomplishments with her students. But as you said, with the parameters of time in the school year, what do you think is maybe, whether it be chapters or certain individuals?
Okay. I mean, so I think the question would be like, what is your definition of contribution, right? Is the contribution, did the discovery change US history? Or is the contribution like this person's story on an individual level is compelling and reveals other things about what kind of obstacles they overcame at particular moments?
Yeah, I think Carol is definitely looking for maybe more of an inspirational figure
Okay.
and their everlasting legacy, she frames it as, to inspire them to reach higher and wider in their own lives, is what she was thinking.
Okay. Well, I mean, she said 5.
She said 5, but
Okay.
I know
I mean,
that
I
might
think
be tough.
I think Sacagawea's and being part of the core of discovery, I think her story is extremely compelling. I mean, she overcame so much, having been kidnapped as a child, forced into marriage. She had her newborn baby with her on this journey. Without her, the expedition, I believe, might not have succeeded, because she's able to negotiate for horses and get them to the Pacific Ocean, and identifies landmarks. Anyway, and that mission, right, of course, is hugely significant to U.S. history. So I think Sacagawea's story should definitely be in there. I think John Muir and the rise of the conservation movement, that him and others in that story that marks a really important shift in the history of exploration, from the acquisition of land to the conservation of land. So I think that story is important. William Shepard's story, I think, is remarkable and unusual, and kind of like maybe challenges what we think we know about that period through his experiences as an African-American man in the Belgian Congo. Matthew Henson's story, I think I would choose as number 4, because it tells us a lot about what obstacles he overcame in the Jim Crow era. And I think that race to the North Pole is globally significant, and still resonates with so many people today. And then for number 5, I would probably choose Sally Ride, because I think the space race is another hugely significant moment in U.S. history. And it really shows a lot about how geopolitical concerns can lead to kind of like the funding and the fueling of exploration of, frontiers beyond what people had dreamed of just decades earlier.
Thank you, Amanda.
It's a great question.
Absolutely. And now Matt is asking, did you look into any explorers who were looking for natural resources like minerals or petroleum?
Yes, James Beckworth comes to mind there. So he was such a creative person. He just always happened to be at the right place at the right time in U.S. history. And so he happened to be in California right around when the gold rush started. So he caught, I believe, what was the first steamship coming from Panama, and he just is able to hop on board and gets off and, runs off to the hills to prospect for gold. So he does prospect for gold during the gold rush. However, he also realizes that it's more likely that he's going to make money selling goods to prospectors than he is just digging for gold. And so he he's very entrepreneurial, and so engages in that kind of work as well. And then what he's famous for in his chapter is not for finding a lot of gold, but actually for discovering what was the lowest pass through the Sierra Nevada mountains, which was really important for migrants who were coming west, because it saved their animals the strain of traveling higher with all of their gear and things. So Beckworth built that pass himself, and you can visit it today and see its marker. So he is an example of a figure who was looking for resources, but then found other ways to make discoveries and survive as well on the Western frontier.
You mentioned how people can still visit that location today, and that kind of leads into Tony's question.
Great.
Has your research on these explorers ever led you to do your own exploring to any place on Earth?
Yes. So I didn't mention this, but when I first began writing this book, I basically took a 2-week journey across the country, following in the footsteps of the Corps of Discovery, and then also stopping at other places on the way, like Beckworth's Pass, for figures who I knew were going to be in the book. So that was, I sadly wasn't able to go up the Missouri River itself. I was very comfortable in my car. But it was really fun to go across the country and to see the landscape changing, right? To go from just the absolute flatness of South Dakota, and then you go into the mountains, and it's kind of like dry, sandy mountains. And then, you get to Idaho, and it's these big, beautiful evergreen mountains. And then you reach the Oregon coast, and, juxtaposing your own experience with what you're reading about in the journals of the Corps of Discovery. That was really I'll remember that for the rest of my life. It was a lot of fun.
That sounds like an incredible journey that you were able to go on, especially for, your research purposes in that sense. And you selected many different individuals to examine, as a few people have mentioned in the audience, and they were wondering who had the most engaging one in terms of going through the archives, but also just this is a little bit of a untraditional research method of going on your journey, but that could also be part of, your archive work.
So the question is, whose stories kind of were most compelling in terms of archival research?
Yes, and just your research process in general. Yes.
Yeah. I think Matthew Henson was a fascinating figure to research. So there are a couple different great, and I can say in the book too, I have extensive endnotes, and should people be interested in learning more on their own. But Matthew Henson has an autobiography that tells his own version of what happened. And then you can compare his version of what happened with Robert Peary's version of what happened in the different accounts that was published. The Explorers Club of New York houses the Peary piece, many of the archives relating to that exhibition. So does Morgan State University. So you can see, for instance, the gloves that Matthew Henson wore, or one of the sleds. And so to see like the real artifacts and then compare that with what you were reading about. The Explorers Club also has photographs of Inuit people that they took, and of that landscape from the early 1900s. So just the range of materials and the depth of materials made his story, I think, my favorite to research and write about.
Thank you for sharing. Now, Deborah from Brooklyn asks, who in your book has an autobiography, if anyone, that we can use and read as a primary source?
Great. Yes, I can tell you that. James Beckworth has an autobiography. Laura Ingalls Wilder has an autobiography. John Muir writes about his childhood. Matthew Henson has an autobiography. Amelia Earhart writes about her childhood. And I think that's it.
Perfect. And you already mentioned troubled upbringings being kind of a common thread that you found in your research, but with such a diverse cast, and especially throughout American history, were there any common characteristics, like additional ones, that you could trace through your research that you felt flowed through the entire book?
Yeah, I think one thing we haven't talked about is adaptability and flexibility. And so what do you give up when your plan isn't going the way you thought it would go when you're out there on whatever kind of frontier that you're on? So I mentioned how James Beckworth isn't finding gold in the California mountains. So he, changes his plan and focuses on trade and on this path. And then someone like Amelia Earhart, right, when she's on her transatlantic journey, she was the first woman to fly she flies from Newfoundland to Ireland, 5 years to the day after Charles Lindbergh makes his solo transatlantic journey. But all these things go wrong like immediately, which you can read about in her chapter. The instruments in her airplane aren't working, so she can't tell how high or low she is. There's something that's burning at a rate that's not supposed to be burning at, and she's afraid that the plane will, fall apart. And so does the question, like, you might if it were me, I probably would have just like panicked and given up, but she's just so determined to keep on going. And so I think that determination as well, when things aren't going wrong, and just figuring out how to get through whatever trouble you're having, is a skill that many explorers did possess.
And that's definitely bringing it back to Carol's question, I believe, of being able to look up to these explorers and how they had their journeys and have themselves and challenges with them. And I think we're closing out here, but just one final question, which I've seen pop up. What techniques, this is more for the writer side of you, I suppose. What techniques do you employ as a writer to keep the historical content engaging for contemporary readers? As we know, history can sometimes not be everybody's favorite, but I know a lot of us are very interested in it still.
That's a good question. So I've written 2 books, and my first book was an academic book. And in graduate school, right, we're trained to let the evidence, to look at the evidence and then talk about what we learn from the evidence. And we're not really thinking about storytelling as much. And so this is my first trade book, and it's much more character driven, right? So there's, a character in each chapter who's the center of that story. And then each chapter is framed in such a way that, it's not like a biography of their whole life in each set of 30 pages, which is how long the chapters are. It's about like what the most pivotal journey or discovery they made was. So what, a little bit about their childhoods, what gets them to the point at that moment where they're about to embark on this exciting journey, and then kind of like the aftermath of that journey. So I hope that's kind of a structure that works for readers. not just pouring information on them, but really telling it in a narrative way about the most compelling and influential parts of their lives.
And just to close out, I guess one last final question. How has your understanding of the word explore as a whole changed, and what do you want readers to take away from this word, which is so often brought up in society?
Yeah, I mean, I hope readers come away inspired to do their own kinds of exploring. I think exploration is so much more than looking at uncharted land. I think it involves being curious, wanting to find the answers to some question. Um, it can mean exploring places where you're not familiar with the culture or just the environment in general. It doesn't have to be a place where there are no people. So I think there are many ways that we in our own lives can be explorers. And I hope that, again, readers come away inspired to do lots of different kinds of exploring in their own lives.
So we didn't have quite enough time to get to everyone's questions here today, but I encourage our audience to pick up a copy of The Explorers, and you can find all your answers and an overall excellent read over at the Gilder Lehrman Bookshop. And before I pass it over to Cheryl Ann for some closing remarks, I just wanted to say that it's been a pleasure. Amanda, thank you so much for joining us here on Book Breaks, and it's been a great time speaking with you, so thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you, everyone, for your amazing questions. That was really wonderful.
Back to you, Cheryl Ann.
That Q&A was awesome, and I learned even more. Okay, so everyone who is here, oh, I wanted to start on slide 8, so we'll just go back through. No big deal. First, and I'm going to thank you a million times, Amanda, so please just like bear with me. I really enjoyed this, and I hope I'm speaking on behalf of everyone who's here. And thank you so much for sharing your expertise and for giving us your time today. So before everyone goes, please note the History Scholar of the Week submissions. It is a chance for middle and high school students to win a $50 gift certificate for use in the Gilder Lehrman gift shop. They could spend their money on, I don't know, The Explorers, or perhaps some other wonderful Gilder Lehrman book recommendations or some merch. So please have your students submit a question for the historian being featured on the next Book Breaks using the Google form. The winning question will be announced and asked on the program, and the student and their teacher will win a $50 gift certificate for use in the gift shop. Students will also receive an extra credit certificate, which I think is pretty awesome. And for us, before we close out, what's next? I know you're all wondering. Well, first of all, please visit the bookshop to purchase your copy of The Explorers. The Affiliate Commission supports the programming, so every time you buy a book through Gilder Lehrman's bookshop, Gilder Lehrman gets money to keep doing these wonderful programs. The next Book Breaks is Sunday, July 28th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Please join us for Robert W. Merry on Decade of Disunion, How Massachusetts and South Carolina Led the Way to Civil War, 1849 to 1861. You can also, if you would like, watch the archive of more than 200 scholar presentations on book breaks at gilderlehrman.org/book breaks. And also don't forget to visit gilderlehrman.org for the many, 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 many wonderful resources that Gilder Lehrman offers teachers and the public, including documents and essays, the National History Teacher of the Year Award, nominations, digital exhibitions, EduHam, the Hamilton Education Program, and so, so, so much more. Thank you everyone who came today. We appreciate your participation. And Amanda, thank you again. And Jared, thanks for being an awesome co-host with me.